Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Saturday everybody. I hope you are all enjoying your weekend. First up, let's move through a motley set of developments related to Taiwan, and we will start with developments coming out of Beijing, and then move to the US and her allies. On Wednesday this week, the People's Republic of China Foreign Ministry, through its spokesperson, said China, quote, highly appreciates Russian President Vladimir Putin's criticism of US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's provocative Taiwan visit, as Putin's position shows China-Russia high-level strategic coordination and the firm support the two countries have rendered each other on issues concerning their core interests, end quote. Earlier in the week, Putin, unsurprisingly, supported Beijing's position and condemned the, quote, calculated provocations of the US, end quote. In the same press conference, the Foreign Ministry spokesperson once again employed fairly boilerplate language demanding the US respect the One China principle. Party mouthpiece, the People's Daily, running a special series called The Recent Fallacies of the US Are Full of Bandit Logic, published a second installment this week called Who is Really Changing the Status Quo in the Taiwan Strait? Among other points, the piece writes, quote, the United States has gone further and further on the road of falsifying, hollowing out, and distorting the One China principle, contrary to its commitments made in the 3 joint communiques, end quote. The third installment, Who is Escalating the Tension in the Taiwan Strait, was published yesterday, in which the state-run outlet wrote, quote, the Ukraine crisis was provoked by the United States. Instead of learning from its mistakes, the US is now stirring up a crisis across the Taiwan Strait. It is the US that is undermining world peace. For the sake of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, regional countries must keep a high degree of vigilance against the US side's continued efforts to fuel the fire, increase its military deployment, and plot to create a greater crisis, end quote. This week too, Beijing published a list of, quote, Taiwan separatists, end quote, to be sanctioned, with state media writing, quote, the list is published in batches in order to give certain people on the island maximum opportunities to correct their errors, end quote. Of course, the persons on the list do not have assets in the People's Republic of China mainland, and thus the sanctions will be of little consequence. Meanwhile, moving from Beijing but staying in East Asia, Japanese media outlet Kyodo News reports that Japanese lawmakers, including the head of the so-called Japan Republic of China Diet Members Consultative Council, are, quote, expected to meet with Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen and defense officials on the island to reaffirm the ties during the 3-day visit from next Monday, end quote. And if that news wasn't frustrating enough for Beijing to hear, this week we also learned that a delegation of Canadian lawmakers plans to visit Taiwan in October to seek economic opportunities in the Asia-Pacific region. But the big news on the Taiwan front this week is that the United States and Taiwan are beginning the process to sign a formal bilateral trade agreement. Multiple US media outlets are reporting that Washington and Taipei have agreed on a negotiating mandate for trade talks. Politico, for example, writes that the first round of negotiations is expected early this fall. That will take place under the auspices of the American Institute in Taiwan and Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in Washington. Quote, that's because the terms of the U.S. diplomatic recognition of the People's Republic of China in 1979 required the U.S. to sever formal diplomatic ties with the self-governing island, end quote. Now, while we're on the dynamics of the broader US-China competition, let's discuss an aspect of the technology competition in that relationship. We remember that the United States has had a series of technology restrictions imposed against the People's Republic of China since the Trump era in order to prevent certain Chinese firms from having access to the most advanced of American technology. This week, US media outlet The Wall Street Journal published a popular piece, however, arguing that many of these technology restrictions have no teeth. Now quoting the piece, the Commerce Department-led process that reviews US tech exports to the country approves almost all requests and has overseen an increase in sales of some particularly important technologies, according to an analysis of trade data. Of the US's total $125 billion in exports to China in 2020, officials required a license for less than 0.5%. Commerce Department data shows. Of that fraction, the agency approved 94%, or 2,652 applications for technology exports to China. The figures omit applications returned without action, meaning their outcomes were uncertain. The result? The US continues to send to China an array of semiconductors, aerospace components, artificial intelligence technology, and other items that could be used to advance Beijing's military interests. Matt Pottinger, former President Donald Trump's Deputy National Security Advisor, said the agency's Export Controls Unit, quote, has struggled to reconcile its mission to protect U.S. national security with the Commerce Department's objective of promoting U.S. exports. The dilemma is most acute when it comes to China. End quote. Other commentators argue that the situation is more complicated than this, however. We remember last month, China's largest chipmaker, Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, SMIC, started shipping advanced 7-nanometer semiconductors, a breakthrough that came somewhat as a surprise to many. However, UK-based Japanese-owned Financial Times asks, quote, how much time and money the company is willing to sink into producing them at scale using a method their international rivals have abandoned for a more efficient one. End quote. In the piece titled China's Chip Breakthrough Poses Strategic Dilemma, the Financial Times points out 1. 7-nanometer chips trail the 5-nanometer generation of chips offered by Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company and South Korea's Samsung, and 2. The US is blocking exports of extreme ultraviolet machines to China. As such, SMIC cannot secure EUV equipment, thus relying on deep ultraviolet machines instead, which experts argue has very poor yields. This means for China's SMIC to be successful, it will either need to develop ultra-advanced new technology or rely on massive amounts of state subsidies. And this is just to produce advanced, but not cutting-edge chips. Now let's end with the Chinese economy, and international commentators and economists are becoming increasingly bearish in their outlook, with a bunch of high-profile growth projection downgrades this week. For example, Goldman Sachs once again lowered its projection of GDP for the country to 3% this year from 3.3%. Nomura Holdings Inc. went further, cutting its forecast from 3.3% to 2.8%. In a note this week, Nomura analysts explained that they anticipate a further deterioration of the property sector, local government's fiscal conditions, and export growth. They also argue that the COVID-0 policy is very much a wild card. We remember from Thursday's video that media controlled by the central bank has called for a stronger fiscal response to stabilize growth. We also remember that local governments have been directed to use more special bonds to raise the funds for this fiscal spending. Bloomberg's Hong Kong team writes this week, quote, without more revenue, a number of analysts have said that local governments will face a fiscal cliff in the second half of the year, as the deficit has expanded much faster than initially forecast in March. End quote. We remember this week we learned from the Ministry of Finance that local government's revenue from selling land use rights, a critical source of income, in the 7 months to July this year plummeted almost 32% year on year. Now, let's end this part on Chinese growth and today's video with this observation from Peking University Professor of Finance, Michael Pettis. Quote, most analysts have cut their 2022 GDP growth expectations for China to between 2.8 and 3.3%. To me, however, the real story is not the decline in expected GDP growth, but rather the terrible deterioration in the quality of growth. I expect 2022 to look a lot like 2020, with almost no high-quality growth, maybe even a contraction, along with a very worrying surge in the country's debt burden. Most of this growth should really be thought of as activity rather than growth. End quote. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit the like button. It's a huge help. And for anyone who wants to go the extra mile and help me continue making these episodes every day, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. That is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Thank you, everybody, for all the support. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody. And I'll see you all on Monday.